And we now have political analyst Richard Hadarian joining us. He is actually in Spain right now, I believe. Richard, good morning to you.
Good evening and good morning, Karen. As always, a pleasure.
All right. Thank you so much for joining me. How significant is it, Richard, that President Marcos chose Indonesia as his first foreign trip as president?
Right. I mean, let's put this into historical context. I mean, previous Filipino presidents also always tend to attend ASEAN-related events or an ASEAN country for their first foreign visit, right? If you remember, back in 2016, President Duterte also visited Indonesia among the first countries, aside from some of the countries in Indochina, and that was related within the context of ASEAN. And President Duterte got a very warm reception from President Jokowi, and if you remember very well, President Jokowi, of course, in some ways was also drawing inspiration from President Duterte when it comes to the war on drugs situation. So that created some sort of, let's say, awkwardness around the issue of approaching the Ms. Veloso's case, right? So in this case, we see President Marcos Jr. also having Indonesia as one of the first countries to visit, and also later Singapore. So in that sense, it actually follows a trend. Now, what remains to be seen is the kind of rapport that he will build with regional leaders, especially Indonesia, which is the de facto leader within ASEAN, and Singapore, of course, which is one of the most proactive strategic player in this part of the world. And both of these countries, by the way, are renowned for their so-called non-aligned foreign policy, independent foreign policy. So let's see how Marcos Jr. will try to also shape his own version of independent foreign policy, which Duterte was always talking about, in light of his engagements with these two key countries within ASEAN.
Okay. And Richard, I'm curious, other than trade, what do you believe is most important in terms of national interest that the Philippines should pursue with Indonesia?
Well, I mean, Indonesia is very, very important neighbor of us. We don't talk about Indonesia as much, but remember, we have overlapping maritime borders. We were successfully able to delimit or at least find some understanding around some of our overlapping waters down in the south in our case, and of course far to the east in the case of Indonesia. When it comes to Indonesia, of course, they have also been trying to help us with building our naval capacity. Indonesia has also tried to provide us with, I think, trains, some basic infrastructure. So my sense is there's a lot that we can do with Indonesians in terms of fighting against piracy, against terrorism. Perhaps Indonesia could also be helpful to us down the road in terms of the peace process in Mindanao. And Indonesia, by the way, of course, is a country that also has its own maritime disputes with China in the case of North Natuna Sea. And they're doing their own kind of approach to manage and their concerns with China and also defend their national interests. So perhaps we also can learn a thing or two from Indonesians in terms of defending our interests in the West Philippine Sea. So I hope our relationship goes well beyond a single issue or two. We're talking about the biggest economy in the region. We're talking about a major neighbor of ours. But for some reason, I think we don't even have many direct flights between Jakarta and Manila last time I visited Indonesia. So the room for improvement is just so much. And it's one of the most untapped yet important bilateral relations in this part of the world.
Okay. Now, what do you make of it, Richard, that the next trip of the president is Singapore? I mean, given the size of Singapore, but we do know the state of the economy of Singapore. There are other ASEAN countries that have a much bigger population than Singapore. And in terms of trade, the Philippines could gain more, let's say, from other ASEAN countries instead of Singapore. But what is the value of Singapore as the next trip?
Right. I mean, as far as Singapore is concerned, it's definitely the most proactive, dynamic, strategic player in this part of the world. If you remember last year, there were two cabinet-level U.S. officials, the defense minister and also Vice President Kamala Harris, who visited Singapore. So Singapore is essentially has become this kind of strategic hub. More than that, it's also an economic hub. Let's not forget that Singapore actually is the gateway for foreign investments across ASEAN. I just look at the numbers the other day. The biggest source of investments in Indonesia, for instance, is actually Singapore last year, right? And a lot of that investment is not directly from Singapore, but from companies who are invested in Singapore. Remember, Singapore is a headquarters of multinational companies. It's where massive investments from China comes through, massive investments from US and Europe comes through. So that's why Singapore might be small in size, but in terms of its strategic significance, access to capital, not to mention learning lessons on strategic proactiveness, I think they can offer us a lot. And not to forget, of course, Singapore is also a country that has been really a bridge, an interlocutor between China and the West for the past half a century since the late Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. So I think Marcos can also have some very interesting discussion with Singaporean counterparts on how to approach our really complicated yet potentially fruitful relations with both superpowers.
Okay. And Richard, what steps can this president do that's different from the last administration to actually improve foreign direct investments in terms of numbers?
Well, there's a lot, right? And I mean, first of all, in fairness to President Marcos Jr., I mean, his critics would say he has not talked about, some critical issues like press freedom, justice, human rights in his, first State of the Nation address or his inauguration address. But at the same time, he has also steered clear of very controversial divisive issues. Let's say the issue of, crackdown on progressive groups. Let's talk, for instance, the issues like drug war, federalism. So I think in that way it could help him, because if you look at Marcos Jr., he has really zeroed on issues of food security. He has zeroed on issues of investments, economics. First third of his SONA was all about economics. He's very comfortable talking about economics. So first of all, having a Filipino president who is literate in macroeconomic issues, in international business issues, I think helps. Second, he's bringing his economic team. So Secretary Balisacan, some of the top technocrats in his government are accompanying him. So a lot can be explored. We have to get more information on what are the big businessmen from the Philippines who could be there. But I think the fact that Marcos Jr. has been trying to create his own version of unity by steering clear of controversial issues could help also in improving the Philippines' image. Because let's be honest, yes, President Duterte is very popular in the Philippines. He had very high approval ratings. But believe me, I mean, I've been all around the world all the time. And as far as the drug war is concerned, that was turning off a lot of investors. In fact, that was a big topic when President Duterte was in Korea and tried to convince people that the drug war, the human rights situation in the Philippines is not going to be detrimental to the business community. And yet that was really it really created a lot of negative opinions. So I think Marcos Jr. has a lot of room for improvement there. Lastly, also in terms of laws, right? Special laws that he has been passing to streamline investments and make government and taxation more efficient.
Okay. No, that's a very good observation, Richard, considering that in fairness to the administration of Duterte, there were amendments that supposedly would make business flow much easier, right, in the Philippines, in terms of even opening up several industries for foreign investors.
Well, you see, that was the challenge under the previous administration. We had many very competent officials in the administration. We had a number of actually good things that happened on the legal front in terms of policy. Even on the West Philippines, for instance, we were proactive in modernizing our facilities sa Pag-asa, for instance. Taxation, we tried to streamline that. But the signals from the very man on the top, right, President Duterte, sometimes I think was not what foreign investors were looking for. And people have been dealing with over the past 5-6 years have been asking about the situation in the Philippines. So I think President Marcos Jr. is much more sensitive to international sentiment, right? Like just look at how he talks, right? Clearly, the language, the prose, the way he speaks even English is really geared towards an international business community, right? So I think he's in a very unique position to try to reassure them. And of course, Karen, since in the past 6 years, the Philippines economy actually grew. I mean, the size of economy is larger. Yes, the pandemic hit us hard, but we have a bigger middle class. There is still a lot of massive infrastructure projects, Karen, of course, that Marcos wants to continue, that they were unfinished under Marcos. But they're new projects. We're talking about $11 billion airport project, for instance, in Sangli. So, I mean, if you're an Indonesian businessman, right, you're looking at those things and you're looking at a lot of opportunity to get involved. So given the massive infrastructure and food security program of President Marcos, there are a lot of big projects, right, to entice the international community. So I think Marcos Jr. can actually dangle that and say, come on, this is the time for you to invest and to bet on the Philippines.
Yeah. Okay. Now, September is going to be very busy for President Marcos because after
Right.
Indonesia and Singapore, his biggest outing would be, and some consider it's an introduction to the world, would be when he
Right.
speaks and addresses the UN General Assembly on September 20. How significant is this, number one, for President
Right.
Marcos himself, considering the history of the Marcos family?
Right. And not to mention the court cases in the
Yes,
United
yes.
States, right? I think that's something we have to keep in mind.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, I mean, first of all, Karen, I mean, one thing we're all watching for or watching out for is which will be the first major, capital as far as powers are concerned for Marcos Jr. We saw in the case of President Duterte, it was China and Japan back to back, and no Western capital
Yeah,
whatsoever
yeah.
for 6 years. So, in fairness to President Duterte, he did stick to his promise of not visiting the US or any major Western capital. So let's see if the White House is part of the discussions, perhaps middle of this next year. Will China and Japan be ahead of US or not? So I think in the New York visit, there could be a chance for even sideline meetings with our major counterparts, including President Joseph Biden. So far, the interaction between Marcos Jr. and the Biden administration has been stellar. I mean, within a month or so, President Marcos talked to at least 4 high-level officials, Wendy Sherman, Blinken in person. Also, Biden was the first foreign leader. I mean, I think according also to President Marcos Jr., who called him and congratulated him. So they started on a very good point, which of course, Karen, is 180 degrees different from what we saw under President Duterte in his first few months, where
Yeah.
we had extremely contentious relations. And remember, during the ASEAN East Asia Summit back then in Laos, Jokowi had to essentially save Obama and Duterte from sitting next to each other. And that was the context of very warm meeting between Jokowi and Duterte. So this time it's very different. So the way I put it is, this is the great restoration, right? I mean, under Marcos,
That's
we're not
very
only talking about
interesting.
restoration.
It's the Great
Right.
Restoration.
Yes, not only restoration of Marcos's to the Malacanang, which
Yeah.
of course has its own share of critics, but potentially restoration of our bilateral relations with the United States, but of course on new terms. Things have dramatically changed over the past 6 years. China is a different power, US is a different power. The Philippines is never going to be the same after Duterte. But the restoration in the sense that we can have normal conversation with Americans, that we can think about a White House visit by a Filipino president in the near future. We can think about constant institutional dialogue between the two countries, and even discussion of expanded military cooperation. The very things that, Karen, of course, were up in the air, right,
Yeah,
as far as President Duterte's 6 years are concerned. So
Yeah.
that's, I think, the relevance of UN. But yes, you're absolutely right. This is his debut, right?
Yeah.
This is his chance to say the Marcoses are back, but we are not as bad as you think, perhaps the critics. And at the same time, honestly, I mean, Karen, I've been abroad over the past few weeks or so,
Yeah.
whether in Asia and Europe. Everyone is quite interested. It's like, what's up with
I would have
Marcos
to
Jr.?
say,
What's
even
going
friends
on
in
here?
New York, even friends in New
Yes.
York have actually messaged me and were quite excited with the president arriving and visiting New York. And that's the interesting part of this, is because in recent history, no one would think that you would have the son of the late president as the new president. And number two, considering the history, they were exiled in Hawaii.
Right.
And court cases there's in the United States, and that warrant in Hawaii. So what are you seeing, Richard, as the turn for this speech for him?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that's why Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman had to reassure Marcos that he has sovereign immunity. I talked about it before. Let me give you a precedence. The Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, right, he actually had visa ban on him before he became a prime minister because of alleged involvement in some pogroms that happened in Gujarat, where he was the chief in early 2000s. But once he became the prime minister, once he got the sovereign immunity, he really upgraded relations with the United States, and he got very warm receptions, especially under President Trump, right? So we have had a precedence whereby a country strategically important to America, a country that sees the strategic relevance of better relations with America, was able to overcome quite a contentious past. In the case of Modi, it was even more recent past than the Marcoses. The Marcoses were talking about 30, 40 years ago cases. In the case of Modi, it was like 10, 20 years ago, right?
Yeah.
So we have a precedence of massive turnaround in terms of the tempo, texture of bilateral relations. At the same time, if you're Marcos Jr., of course, you want to show a new face to the world. You want to, I don't want to say whitewash, but you want to say that we're more than all of these negative things that were attached to us. And let's not forget, of course, Karen, I think the Marcoses are also looking for the interest of the next generation, right? I mean, he has 3 sons. A lot of next generation Marcoses are already involved in politics. So in fairness to Marcos Jr., I think he's also thinking long-term for the Philippines, for his family. And I think that's why he would want to impress. And Karen, of course, the reception he will get in New York from the media, from the civil society, from the politicians, right, from statesmen, could be a test run of what he could get once he will have a proper state visit to America and to the White House, perhaps sometime in next year. So that's why also it's napakamahalaga ito kasi test run na siya eh.
Oo. And I'm curious, Richard, President Marcos Jr. essentially communicates through his vlogs, social media, which has been quite successful, but hasn't done any international interviews with hard-hitting journalists from international outlets. Are you seeing a possible change? And frankly, is it wise for him to do that?
Well, I mean, first of all, Karen, he's not the first, offspring of a former strongman to become a leader. Even in East Asia, remember Park Yung-ha, the daughter of Park Chung-hee in Korea, Megawati in the case of Indonesia. So Mark is actually not the first, right? So it's interesting to see how those other leaders handled their relations with the Western media, international media. I think that would be a good case study. This will be my advice, perhaps, to the Marcoses. Watch interviews of Park Yung-hee with international media over her father's legacy. I think that would be important. But Karen, I think this is where we will see how good of a press secretary Marcos has, right? Because this is the job of the press secretary in order to organize, to facilitate really a sit down, a proper, thorough discussion, introduction to America and the global audience, not based on a script, not based on friendly conversations and chummy chums, but based on real journalism that speaks truth to power. I mean, you can imagine, folks, whether it's like people like Farid Zakaria or, folks in MSNBC, CNN, etc., they're going to raise some very tough questions. So let's see if Marcos can handle that. Because if I think President Marcos will try to avoid dealing with the hard-hitting or, let's say, really legitimate media, then that will not help in terms of, this is his chance. I think he has a unique chance here. And,
there's a shining moment here.
Yes, at the very least, this is a time for him to clarify things, perhaps, or at least put his own version of history on the table. And I think this is also a time for Marcos Jr. to talk about the future. The past is contentious, it's very polarizing, but the future could be unifying. I mean, I'm almost giving them the script, right? Like, this is how we should do it, right? Like, when you're going to talk to them, talk about your future vision, right? Yeah.
All right. No, what's interesting is that the president will be meeting with no less than President Biden, as we've mentioned earlier. Right. Do you feel that somehow he is benefiting from the hardball tactics that President Duterte played with the United States, and the U.S. is treating the Philippines far differently than it was in the past, and that's because, frankly, of Duterte's foreign policy?
Right. I mean, Karen, first of all, let's not forget what makes the Philippines relevant is, the tyranny of geography, right? We're right next to Taiwan, separated by very narrow strait. And a conflict over Taiwan is something being seriously discussed. In Europe, because we're discussing the Ukrainian issue, I was actually in Estonia, and I talked to their top leaders, and Taiwan came up in our discussion. So, and the Philippines obviously is part of that. We're also important because we're a key player in the South China Sea, where the U.S. is very worried about what China is doing. We have an alliance with the United States. We can give bases to them or access to our bases to them. So first of all, let's not forget, structurally, geographically, the Philippines has become even more important because of this new Cold War between U.S. and China. But at the same time, Karen, I like what you said, because whether you like President Duterte or not, he has put us on the map. Some would say perhaps not for the best reasons, but he has put us in a map in a sense that the Americans could not take us for granted anymore. right? They had to earn back the trust of the Filipino people. And I think, Karen, to a great degree, that explains why both the Trump administration and the Biden administration had to finally clarify whether the Mutual Defense Treaty was relevant in the context of the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea disputes. We did not get that from the Nixon administration all the way to Obama. You remember very well, Karen.
Definitely.
Obama was asked by two different reporters, right? Manila Bulletin and also ABS-CBN, will they help us? And he gave us a lawyerly answer, essentially, just to be polite about it, right? But both Biden and Trump's administration said, no, if the Philippine vessels, Philippine aircraft, Philippine soldiers, right, are attacked in the South China Sea, the Mutual Defense Treaty will apply in favor of the alliance, right? So in fairness, you're absolutely right, Karen. There's evidence to suggest that suddenly there's more urgency to this alliance. But Karen, that doesn't mean that you can go on forever lampooning the Americans for supposedly being unreliable. You cannot go forever threatening. You can just do that for a certain time. So I think in a way, Duterte was the great reset, right? Before this great restoration, but on a different terms. So let's just call it a transition period. I think that was what we saw under President Duterte.
All right. My last question is, not all world leaders are able to speak at the UN General Assembly, and President Marcos will be one of, some have said, the fortunate few, because apparently the country has to, the right word is let the UN General Assembly know that you will be speaking. And even before the victory of President Marcos, the Philippines was already on the list of those who would be speaking for the UN General Assembly. What do you believe would be vital for the president to mention in his speech, considering this is an important opportunity?
Karen, the Philippines has been a pillar of the United Nations. We had great diplomats like Mr. Romulo, who played a key part in the United Nations. Salvador Lopez, for instance, a former foreign minister of the Philippines, who was a key player in the drafting of the United Nations human rights regime in the United Nations, for instance. The Filipino diplomats played a vital role in the shaping the foundations of what we call today as United Nations. So when we bash United Nations, we're bashing our own legacy. So I think it's very, very important for President Marcos to remind the world that whatever you may think about our previous president, right? Or you may think about the Philippines and its place in the world, do not forget our contributions. And do not forget that the Philippines is a proactive contributor to international security and peace. We have been one of the biggest contributors to UN peacekeeping missions all around the world, from East Timor, to all sorts of different conflict zones. Filipinos have been a big part of United Nations bureaucracy and infrastructure. And we were with Ukraine on so many levels. If you look at their voting record, we voted in favor of sovereignty, of dignity. We voted against aggression. So we have been actually a very responsible member of the United Nations. Yes, President Duterte has his own paradigm on UN. We had some criticism of UN. But let's not forget, this is the chance for President Marcos to remind the world that the Philippines, in many ways, actually, Karen, we're not a small country, we're a middle power, right? And a big part of making us a middle power is our active contribution to international peace and security, the key role we play in many dimensions of multilateral cooperation and diplomacy. And I think this is a chance for President Marcos to remind that do not take the Philippines for granted. And the Philippines is not taking the United Nations for granted too, and will be continuing to have this proactive contribution. And let's not forget also, lastly, Karen, our current foreign minister, Ambassador Manalo, used to be also based in the United Nations, right? So I think this is the context within which makes this trip very, very special and a great opportunity for the Philippines, not only President Marcos.
And would you want the president to actually mention the West Philippine Sea issue and our issues with China in the United Nations General Assembly?
Right. I mean, of course, I do not expect President Marcos to try to preempt our relations with China or any major power by taking a, let's say, categorically divisive or potentially controversial stance. But clearly, he can talk about themes like freedom of the seas, right? Freedom of navigation, peace and security, right? The interests of smaller nations, right? Our opposition to bullying, our stance in favor of international rule of law. I think so. If he talks in thematic terms, right? I think that, first of all, avoids contentious issues or creating diplomatic crisis. But at the same time, in many ways, it could also help us to to elevate these issues into the center of the international discussion, right? Karen, the Singaporeans have been doing this forever, right? But I think it's time for us Filipinos to also do it. After all, we are much more on the front line than the Singaporeans, and our English is just as good as the Singaporeans, right? So maybe we should also do that as far as regional peace and security discussions are concerned, and no less than the United Nations, of course, as our platform.
All right. Richard A. Darian, thank you so much for joining me today, and you take care over there.
My pleasure. Have a good day.